It's an enormous honour to stand in the Australian Parliament to speak on this bill tonight. It's been a very, very long time coming, but we're getting close. I want to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples whose country we meet on each and every time this Parliament sits, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples. Pay my respects to their continuing culture and leadership of these lands and waters. I also want to pay respect to the traditional owners of the country from which I come from and represent in this Australian Parliament, the Awabakal and Worimi peoples who have looked after the most beautiful land around Newcastle and our surrounds, the creeks, the wetlands, the skies, the mountains. And I really also want to acknowledge a lot of very important people who have played a critical role in my learning and my understanding, much of which took place before I came to this Parliament, but there's not a single day where I'm still not learning about the weight of our history in this nation and what it means to forge a just relationship with First Nations people. I do want to acknowledge when I came back to Newcastle, I'd been away as a young woman, like many Novocastrians, left my hometown when I was 17, went to university, became an anthropologist, lived up in the Kimberleys for 10 years, where my life was profoundly changed. But it didn't happen in a vacuum, even that. And I never in my wildest dreams did I ever assume I would be standing on the floor of the Australian Parliament getting to speak on a bill all these decades later about issues that people were talking to me about when I was 20 years old. And so it's not so much about my journey. Some might think I'm a slow learner. It's taken a long time to get to this point, but I am deeply indebted to the Bunuba men and women who were part of my learning in those very, very formative years as a young and pretty naive anthropologist. And when I came back to Newcastle, I knew that I could no longer live in my hometown without relationships with the First Nations people. And so I was really, really fortunate to be introduced to a group of senior men and women who had forged a group called the Newcastle Aboriginal Support Group, long, long before I came back to Newcastle. And it was there that I met extraordinary, one of Australia's most preeminent Aboriginal historians, John Maynard. Leaders like Ray Kelly, leaders that are still, these men are still very actively involved in my community. People like Kath Butler, who currently heads up the Wallatuka Institute, Lauren Collier, Amanda Kelly. There are too many to name, indeed, but these were all very, very important people for me in my journey of understanding. And I'd have to recognise a group of non-Indigenous elders who helped shape my thinking as well, people like all of whom have passed now, Rodney Knox, Stan Masterson, Jack Doherty, Pat Keating, Pat Cameron. These were important teachers in my life. And once you have learnt to see anew, to see with some fresh eyes, to listen with different ears, you don't get to undo that. And that's actually a good thing. It's confronting sometimes, it's unsettling sometimes, but it is a journey that I'd never regret. I've never, ever regretted in my life. And so I think it is, here I find myself in the Australian Parliament now, having worked with Aboriginal people for, the last 30 years of my life, on a range of issues that go to the very heart of this referendum, and that is, how do we establish a just relationship? We've had 235 years of a colonial project which has been bloody, has been violent, has ongoing impacts, and how do we reset that compass now? And whilst First Nations people have every right to be angry, to be horrified, to be to feel as though this was a fight that was never going to come to fruition, they have never given up. And every time I have felt a little, more than frustrated, I've shared that anger, I've shared that frustration at times around, my God, do we, the baby steps we take, will we ever grow up as a nation? But there's a real learning for me in this too, and that is, one, what right do I have to feel that level of frustration? My journey has been maybe 30 years compared to 235 years. And I also just think, well, it's important that as a nation we are all coming together for this journey. It's not just, me and what I've done in my life. That's quite irrelevant. But people like, as I said, John Maynard, Nathan Towney, Kath Butler, Ray Kelly, Lauren Collier, people who took to a Newcastle forum just a couple of weeks ago to explain the benefits of a voice and why local Aboriginal leaders, men and women in Newcastle, were going to stand up and support a voice, a constitutionally enshrined voice to Parliament. I can be no more eloquent than those people on that stage that night. And the words of Lauren Collier's grandmother echo strongly in my ears, even as I stand here now, when Lauren, in summarising some of the, the debates that had been taking place that night, just said, what? When I talked to my grandmother last night about what I was going to say at this forum, she just said, well, you know what, Lauren, we've always had a voice. This is actually about people finally listening. And I don't think that there is any more powerful way in which to put the duty and responsibility that now rests with each and every Australian citizen. Referendums are momentous occasions. Changing this constitution is hard work, really hard work. Those founding fathers, and they were all men, they didn't see that we were going to be changing it too often, and they made it pretty damn hard. But it's wrong to think that they thought it was never to change, that it was not an organic document. And there are some glaring omissions. Australian women know that. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people know that. And this is our opportunity to make good on a really grave wrong, a wide, wide gap within our constitution. This is the birth certificate of this nation. It is a document of great importance, yet it fails to either recognise or indeed celebrate the extraordinarily rich and utterly unique part of Australia, and that is the First Nations people of these lands. It makes us different to any other country in this world. It's what, we often celebrate, and yet we, to date, have not had the courage to ensure that our constitution would recognise the 65 years of prior occupation of these lands. I've had a great privilege in recent months to serve as a member on the Joint Select Committee of Aboriginal on the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice Referendum. It was established to help guide this debate this evening, really, to look at the draft proposed question that was to come before the Australian people. And as others before have said, it's quite a simple question that everyone will be asked in the coming months, and that was, do we agree to this proposed law to alter our constitution to recognise the First Peoples of Australia by establishing an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voice? Do you approve of this proposed alteration? People will be asked to write the word yes or no. I am personally deeply committed to a yes vote and couldn't imagine anything else. But I also feel the weight of responsibility now to ensure that my community, indeed all of our communities in this place, are making a very informed choice when they walk into that polling booth in the coming months. It's up to us to all take our journeys now to find out the information that we need in order to be satisfied with the vote that we will cast. It is as I said, I sat on that committee. I heard from a lot of experts from the legal, social, economic fields, and every single one of them said this is the question that we should be proposing and putting to the Australian people. Do not be tinkering around the edges. There were people who thought maybe we should just, change it up a bit. Should we keep the word executive in or not? Ignoring the decades and decades of work and debate, sophisticated arguments and conversations that have happened, particularly in First Nations communities, over decades and decades and decades. In fact, when I mentioned John Maynard, the Aboriginal historian at the University of Newcastle, it was his grandfather, Fred Maynard, that headed up the Australian Progressive Aboriginal Association. His grandfather, when you ask someone like John, Professor Maynard, I should say, why he supports this voice to Parliament, he said, well, my grandfather called for this almost 100 years ago. How could I do otherwise? It's not to say that, people have untold limits of unlimited trust in governments in Australia. Experience would suggest otherwise. But for some people, there is more than a century of family history, of struggle, to see this nation own its history, face squarely on that history, to own it, and to seek a just relationship. That's how I want Australians to think about this question. Because once you've been on a journey of learning, you have a couple of choices to make. You don't get to undo it, so you can choose to ignore it, I guess, or you choose to act purposefully. That's my job in this Parliament, to act with purpose, to represent the good people of Newcastle, to be their voice in this Australian Parliament. But my voice tonight is in the hope that a lot of people who have been voiceless to date get to actually have their voice heard, and that we as a nation might stop and take some time to listen and do the only thing that we can do when confronted with all of that history and all of that evidence, and that is vote yes for a constitutionally enshrined voice in the Australian Parliament when that question comes before us.